Okay, oral history. People often ask me, okay, what's the relevance of oral history to Mi'kmaq culture? And you got to remember, this is a culture now that really didn't have a written history. So it's unique in that it's an oral based culture. Stories are passed down through stories. I recall when I was a young boy sitting with many elders and listening to stories. Sometimes you're kind of on the peripheral, but and I would have heard these stories hundreds of times over and over and over, but they're always geared to fit the audience. They unfold like that to depend on the audience, but the message is always the same in it. But when you look at, in the absence of any kind of written culture, recorded culture that we have accomplished that in different ways. That's through language, that's through song, dance, music, myth, and legends. And a good example of oral history would be the fact that here a few years back they tried to put a turbine in the Bay of Fundy to generate electricity. And but before they could accomplish that, they had to do a geological survey of the Fundy bottom, and they discovered that there was a geological event occurred there about 6,000 years ago. There was a ridge that extended from Cape Split to Advocate, Parsboro, and because of this tectonic movement of the plates, the ridge collapsed, and it allowed the water to rush into the Minas Basin, Cobequid, creating some of the highest tides in the world. And but now, when you think about that geological event, and I remember this story as I was when I was a child, and it talked about. I'm going to make it really simple. It's about the whale, the beaver, and Glooskap, the hoarding of water. Glooskap wanted basically the beaver to dismantle that dam, but the beaver would see he didn't want any part of it. So the whale intervened, and the whale, in frustration because the beaver wasn't cooperating with him either, slapped that dam and broke the dam basically, and as a result of smashing that dam, it created these high tides in the Minas Basin and the Cobequid. Now, up to that point, a lot of people didn't pay attention to Migma legends or these stories. Then they realized, wow, Mi'kmaq people at some point in time would have witnessed that geological event happening. So the legend itself has got to be, the story's got to be at least 6,000 years because the event was 6,000 year geological event. And so that would have persisted over time. And you get stories of ice ships, the ice boats, glaciation. You get stories about the transition from tundra type environment to mixed forest, stories about megafauna. As a matter of fact, we have an exhibit here at the Museum of Natural History, re the mastodons, right? Now, these Mi'kmaq legends and stories talk about megafauna like mastodon and these things. But they also they speak to the fact that there's a transition in environment and animals. Now we see smaller animals, caribou, we see the population of our rivers by fish. Some really beautiful stories. So a lot of Mi'kmaq history in their past is rooted in these stories and passed down. Like I say, I remember as a young man, a boy, listening to elders talk, and you often hear concepts like two-eyed seeing, and I often chuckle about it because I say, what's a fitting terminology for Mi'kmaq culture is, and the lack of listening is this two-eared hearing. And I tell people, I said, we two eyes see, but maybe I should have two-eared hearing, because you just got you'll wonder what would you have retained if you listened with both of your ears at one time, right? And listen to these stories and how many you've forgotten over time. And it's that whole process of educating. I often tell kids in lower grades, I said, our classroom might be inside a building. The Migma class would be outside. But they were teaching all the ologies too, biology, zoology, botany, all these things, hydrology. But they're passed down through stories, story after story after story. And a lot of these stories are tied to landscape, physical characteristics that are identifiable on the landscape. Again, Cape Split, different types of other landscape features, Kelly Mountain, Cape Breton, for example. But there's many of them around the ovens, the caves, the ovens. So if you look, while we see a wealth of information in paper documents, there's also a wealth of information in oral history that really reflect the changes that are happening over time. And if you take the time to listen to them, they're very valuable. And people of now are taking them much more seriously than they have in the past, especially Western academic researchers, etc. And but those stories persisted and persisted and persisted, and for years. And that's just I think when we talk about that's the fluidity and how I'm trying to think of the proper word, but resilience of the culture and the longevity of it is really incredible. And I've heard many stories over my day, and they're just as interesting the second time I heard it to the 50th time I heard it. And like I say, they're always geared for some aspect of learning. And it's even better when you have somebody who's good at storytelling, telling those stories. And not only are they listening to them, listen to people's stories, but you can visual. It's like listening to a radio. That's how best I can describe it. When you're listening to a radio program, and you get really immersed in it, and in these oral traditions and stories and legends are the same way. You just become totally immersed in them. And if you're traveling on the land quite often, as I have as an archaeologist, and you can visualize that when you're out there on rivers and lakes and in the interior part of the province. It's just incredible.